Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about taking things out of context. So this phrase, this idea that whatever you have said, my political opponent, is taken out of context, has had a renaissance lately. Particularly since the murder of Charlie Kirk, the right-wing political activist, influencer, whatever you want to call him. This phrase has been cropping up over and over and over and over and over on social media because critics of Kirk have been reposting text versions or video clips of him saying things that most people consider objectively vile, hateful, and terrible. And defenders of Kirk have usually, well, I don't know if I could say usually, but frequently, I haven't done a study on the frequency to know whether it's usual or not, but they very, very frequently resorted to the "you have taken that out of context" defense. So we're going to talk about what that means and why it's not the get out of jail free card that so many of the people using it on social media seem to think it is, right? Because this is basically the attempt in saying that is, well, you've taken it out of context, so you can't be upset about it, or it isn't really bad, or some variation thereupon. And that is not what taken out of context means. It doesn't mean that the thing is automatically good. It means that there is something in the world with that statement that explains it, justifies it, or limits how bad it is. So if we think about the word itself, context, what does it mean? Well, the root word, or the prefix con means with. Text is best understood in a sort of Derridian sense. That is the sense that Jacques Derrida understood it. He famously said that everything is a text. Basically, a text is anything that is relatively coherent at any scale, big or small, that attempts to convey meaning. So this may be traditional sort of written texts like novels, scholarly books, poems, things like this. But it may also be a TV show, a YouTube video. It may be an individual statement, a text message obviously falls within this category. Speeches, but it can also be sort of a body of work, the collected sermons of a particular religious leader or something like this. Anything that has a degree of coherence and conveys some sort of meaning is a text. So, Charlie Kirk's public statements on his show, his podcast, in his filmed debates with college students, all of these things would be texts. And we can break them up in different ways, right? So a whole debate would be a text, but also the entire corpus of the Charlie Kirk podcast would be a text. And we can look at these things sort of at different levels. So the idea of context is there is stuff with that text, stuff surrounding it in the world that provides additional information. And again, the assertion that you've taken that out of context is currently being used as though whatever else exists in the world automatically makes the thing being critiqued innocuous. Now, it does happen that stuff is taken out of context. That is a very real issue that does occur, right? One way of doing this is selective quotation. And this is a very common way of doing it, right? So this is particularly tricky, or can be particularly tricky with scholarly work, because as scholars, our work exists in conversation with other voices, right? And so let's say you're reading a research article. You have a scholar in this article who has, the author of this article has written a paragraph where they lay out Derrida's theory of the text, right? The way that I just did a couple of minutes ago. They then say, but I disagree because if you quote the portion saying, here is what Derrida says is the case about texts, as though that is the opinion of the author of this article, rather than an opinion that that person is setting up so that they can then make their own argument in contrast to it, then you have taken that out of context. So let's say the author of this article is John Brown. Why not? And John Brown disagrees stridently with Derrida, but writes a paragraph explaining Derrida's idea in a way that Derrida would agree with. Right? This is part of what we want to do as scholars. If you then say, well, John Brown says this thing that Derrida believes, and you leave out the part where John Brown says, but I disagree because, then you're taking that out of context. Quote mining is another way of decontextualizing something, of taking something out of context. And this is often done accidentally by students, in my experience. They will, for instance, find an article online and they will use a keyword search to find just the key terms that they are looking for. And then they will use whatever the article says that agrees with their point. Sometimes that does not reflect the author's actual argument. And again, that's the same kind of thing we just saw with the John Brown Derrida example. On the other hand, you do have people who have an agenda and they will quote mine or misrepresent, or they will distort quotations in order to try and make it seem that someone has said something they have not. So one example of this is religious fundamentalists, when they make arguments for things like young earth creationism or against evolution, things like this, they will often say, well, this famous scientist once said this thing that sounds vaguely like it problematizes evolution, therefore the entire body of evolutionary evidence is invalid, right? And often if you then sort of look at that source, and a number of YouTubers have done this, pro-science YouTubers, atheist YouTubers, people like this, have done this type of work. And they say, okay, but if you actually read this quote and you read the sentence before and after it, it means something completely different than what it appears if you look at just this quote. So taking things out of context is a real problem that does happen. But just saying this thing has been taken out of context is not an automatic excuse for anything, right? Sometimes there is no context that justifies it or explains it or makes it okay, right? So another recent example, the Fox News host who on the air, seemingly out of nowhere, as far as I can tell, suggested that we as a society should just kill homeless people. From all the clips that I've seen, and there could be something I'm missing, I haven't followed this story super closely, but from everything that I've seen, it seems like there is no context to that. Like it's just a statement that he made, and there is nothing surrounding the text of that statement that would seem to make it understandable. So sometimes that's the problem, right? And if you just say, well, you've taken that out of context, but there isn't any context that explains it, then the statement that it's taken out of context does not, in fact, get you out of jail for this, right? It's not a get out of jail free card in that sense. And the other potential issue is sometimes the context does not actually make a thing better, right? Sometimes if you look into the actual context and put it in a larger sphere of what that person has been saying or doing or whatever it is, it doesn't really get better. So for one instance, I'll give you, this is another one. Charlie Kirk said something to the effect of, after one of the many school shootings in the US, or possibly after several of them, he may have repeated this sentiment for all I know, but at least once after school shooting, he said something to the effect of, the cost of the Second Amendment and our right to protect our freedom with guns is that we will sometimes have mass shootings. Now, the context of that, as near as I can tell, is the political right to protect our freedoms is more, it outweighs, the value of that outweighs the value of children not being shot at school. Now, we can agree or disagree on that. Personally, I would disagree on that assertion, but we can have that debate. And I would encourage an actual debate, not the sort of staged debate that Charlie Kirk had, where he and his research team prepped extensively and then debated people who had done no preparation whatsoever under terms that Kirk said, and which he then edited the videos of to eliminate anything that made it look like he was not correct. But that's a whole separate issue. But if that's to go back to his specific statement there, if that's the context, right? We need guns in order to ensure that we have our freedom from a potentially repressive government. The problem is that is advocating political violence, which is the thing that people who are upset with those critiquing Charlie Kirk are saying, right? We shouldn't allow or endorse or support or celebrate political violence. The idea that we need guns in order to fight the government for our rights is inherently rooted in political violence. So even if we set aside the ethically problematic view that the abstract concept of guns maintaining freedom is more valuable than the lives of real, actual children, we still have a context in which he is advocating for a thing that is generally seen by the overwhelming majority of people as a bad thing, right? So again, we have that kind of issue as well, where the context does not actually help make a thing more innocuous. So, what do you, as a writer, arguer, critical thinker, want to know about this? About how to actually establish that something has been taken out of context, right? So because that does happen, right? And it's not a bad argument that this thing should be seen differently than you're seeing it because of the context. But you need to establish that. If you want to make that argument and genuinely have it stick, and I recognize, and I put the caveat on this, that for social media debates, people will not give a shit about the thing I'm about to say, right? Social media debates do not actually typically follow the rules of rhetoric, of logic, of how do you actually substantiate the argument that you're making. And those of us who try and do bring those things into social media often get some variation of too long didn't read. But If you want to actually substantiate a critique that something has been taken out of context and should be reconsidered, what do you have to do? Well, the first thing after saying this has been taken out of context and should be reconsidered is that you have to provide us information about the context. This is step one, right? This is at the level of a stasis point of fact. So within stasis theory, there's the idea that there are different points along an argument at which we might reasonably disagree. This is the first one, a stasis point of fact. Did the thing occur, or does the thing exist? The question becomes, did this person say the thing that is being claimed? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no, right? If this is a distorted quote, or a quote that is sort of taken out of context or misrepresenting the actual argument that's being made, then the answer is no. From a factual perspective, it does not. It did not occur, right? But often it did. So that's one way you can sort of approach this. If the statement was not a real statement by this person, at the level of a stasis point of fact, that's where you build your argument. And you present us with what was actually said in whatever documentary evidence you can provide for that. On the other hand, if the thing that the other person claims was said was actually said, and it is not a misrepresentation, but you argue that there is something around it that justifies it, then you are at a stasis point of value. What does this thing mean? And this can get a bit trickier, right? So here you have to make an argument drawing on that context, drawing out what else in the world justifies or explains or softens this. In a way, you can think about this as justifiable circumstances in a legal trial, right? Like, yes, my client committed the murder, but he was justified by X thing, right? This thing that had happened to him explains why he did what he did, and so his legal and or moral culpability should be lessened. This is essentially the same kind of thing you're doing with a value argument about context. You're saying, yes, this thing exists, it was said or written or whatever it is, but given other things in the world, given the situation, or given additional information, we will see it differently. It will not mean what it appears to mean. It will mean something different. And that can be a very difficult argument to substantiate, in part because it depends on how well you can read this text in situ, right? How well you can read it alongside other things, and how compellingly you can argue that the value of the context outweighs the immediate impression that readers or listeners or viewers or whatever it is will have of that negative statement. But you need to actually do that work if you want to rhetorically establish that something has been taken out of context and that matters. If you don't do that work, if you don't follow through those steps, then you are not substantiating your assertion. You're simply making a claim, and we have no good reason to believe it.